commanders from UN Security Council sanctions. Well, I mean, that kind of gives the lie to all the talk about concern for Darfur, because these are the people who are actually implementing the policies in Darfur. Okay, well, two. So if you're keeping track, this is the second proposal I'm putting forward. Two, any involvement by Washington in future negotiations should be framed towards encouraging a active participation of Darfurian civil society. So that's in stark contrast to the way when the Bush administration in 2006 was pushing a peace agreement. It actually made the situation worse because none of the rebel groups signed on. It was rushed through so quickly that most Sudanese, most people in the rebel groups even hadn't had a chance to see it or have any idea what was in the agreement, so they couldn't possibly sign on to it. Three, Washington should put helicopters and other needed supplies at the disposal of the peacekeepers who are in Darfur now. It's been kind of a shameful saga. The African Union deployed peacekeepers to Darfur in 2004, and from the very beginning they were badly underfunded. Their budget came primarily from developed countries. It's a lot of the same Western countries that have been very vocal in the media in condemning what's happened in Darfur, but aren't supplying the minimal needs of the peacekeepers. It got so bad that the soldiers who composed the peacekeepers in Darfur were not paid for several months. They lacked such basic things as phone lines and petrol for their jeeps so they could go on patrol, and their translators went on strike for a couple months. The chronic underfunding was a major reason, obviously, that the African Union force was not as effective as it should have been. But as a result of this lack of effectiveness, there were calls for the force to be replaced by a UN peacekeeping force. Well, and these calls came from both the Save Darfur establishment and the Washington. They were with one voice on this: get the UN in there. I mean, why would you call for that when you can simply adequately supply the African Union force? Khartoum was resisting deploying a UN force, so there were years of back and forth negotiating to try to get the UN in there, and all this while the African Union force was badly underfunded. Well, once the UN finally was let in, the same dynamic continued. I mean, there was some marginal improvements. It's force. Excuse me. The force is slowly growing, although it's still not at its envisioned capacity. But the underfunding continued when the UN was in there, and was in fact so bad that Newsweek reported that even the helmets are not new. Most soldiers had to paint their green helmets blue. Green being the color of the African Union, and then blue was the UN colors. So some even resorted to tying blue plastic bags with elastic on their helmets. Well, I can imagine. I mean, just imagine if you're a pro-government militia member in Darfur and you see some peacekeeper going around with a bag on their head. It's kind of hard to be intimidated. Perhaps the most emblematic aspect of the plight of the peacekeepers has been the lack of helicopters. They first put out a call for the urgent need of transport helicopters so they could ferry their troops around the region. It's the size of Spain, after all. And they just needed 24 from anywhere in the world. They couldn't get them. So no country could come up with them. Well, actually, 2 countries did volunteer. It was, I think it was Eritrea, perhaps, and some small Southeast Asian country, I believe. Well, it turned out the helicopters that they volunteered weren't up to the standards needed, but it sort of put the developed countries to shame, I think. So there was a report put out by over 50 NGOs called Grounded: The International Community's Betrayal of UNIMID, which is the name for the peacekeeping force. It found that there are helicopters gathering dust in hangars or flying in air shows in Europe. NATO countries alone could have donated far more helicopters than were needed. And the US has 350 helicopters in Iraq right now. Well, there are some real consequences to this. Peacekeepers have died because the Central Command wasn't able to respond to their cries for help in time. In one case, it took 24 hours to reach the site of an attack, and the force commander said that he was positive that his troops would not have bled to death if we had helicopters. He also said the force was doomed to failure if it didn't get the helicopters. They never did get them. It's been over 2 years since then, since they first put out the call. Defense Secretary Robert Gates, he's installed by Bush and maintained by Obama. He has said that the U.S. cannot spare the helicopters because we need them for Iraq and Afghanistan. So, we'd rather use them to foment conflict rather than help end it. The fourth point or proposal is that the United States join the International Criminal Court. So this would give the court much needed legitimacy as it pursues the criminals responsible for the Darfur violence. If the powerful nations ignore the rule of law, we should hardly be surprised when weaker nations also attempt to evade it. Unfortunately, thus far, Washington has taken the lead in flaunting ICC jurisdiction, and Ahmed Haroun, who's one of the Sudanese officials wanted by the International Criminal Court, he said that, quote, "We are not signatories to the court, and neither is the United States. When you sign, we are going to sign. You go first." And reportedly, he sort of laughed at that point because he knew, well, Washington's not going to sign. Well, as activists, we should ask that Washington call his bluff. 5, Washington should facilitate the immigration of Darfuri refugees and lobby its allies to improve their treatment of refugees. So these are countries like Egypt, Israel, and Britain. They each have very kind of shabby records in their treatment of the refugees from Darfur who have come there. Just to take the case of Britain, one Darfuri refugee had his asylum claim rejected on the grounds that the details of his account of his time in Darfur conflicted with information available on Wikipedia. So, you can imagine they actually put this in their report, they cited Wikipedia. That was their source for making this decision about this man's life. I don't know about you, but when I was in school, it was sort of frowned upon to source to Wikipedia. But I guess the British government isn't hiring too many librarians. Well, okay. Kind of gets from tragicomic to worse. The British government the Home Office has actually collaborated with the Sudanese embassy in questioning Darfuri refugees, and they've deported over 100 back to Sudan. One former Darfuri rebel who had been deported described his treatment at the hands of the Sudanese authorities. "The beating in questions went on for days. I was blindfolded most of the time, so I couldn't see what they were using to beat me. Once, when the blindfold was off though, I saw a piece of electric cable. My whole body was numb, so I couldn't feel anything anymore. I was bleeding everywhere. I was soaked in blood. They never let me use the toilet. The room was covered in my feces and urine." This isn't such a good talk for a meal, I guess. "At times I never lost consciousness. I was expecting to die." Well, I guess the Sudanese weren't dumb enough to take pictures like they did at Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, but we can take his word that it wasn't too pretty. So, here's an idea. Let's stop deporting people back to Sudan. Well, okay, sixth, and finally, it's really important for activists who are working on an issue like Darfur to link it with thematically related topics. So this means making strong connections with groups that are working on violence in the Congo or Somalia or Uganda, for instance. And this is crucial because unless you can compel Washington to halt its complicity in violence in, say, Somalia, which it has a heavy hand in, we can be certain that even if our government took a very sincere and honest approach towards Darfur and, say, lobbied the Chinese to stop their weapons shipments to Khartoum,